roles, users, and permissions. So we will actually start with users. Users in dotCMS, pretty straightforward. You've got a user. That user has roles that they belong to, which grant them certain sets of permissions. You can also permission a user individually. Once you get beyond a dozen users, this becomes pretty unmanageable. So it's not the best way to do it. But if you have a specific need for one person to have special permissions, this is one way to do it. There is an additional info tab, which if your organization wants to keep all of this information handy, they can. The one important thing on this page is this active indicator. If someone does not have the active indicator, they cannot log in. So if someone has had problems with logging in, that's one of the first things you check, is their user active. User details, there's two particularly important things on here. It's all important on this particular page. Your email address, your password, all critical. But if you are switching over to using user ID, you need to make sure you know the user ID of your administrative user so you can still log in with it. Even if you're using something like Ldap, there will be times where you need to log in as the built-in dotCMS admin, particularly for things like your license expired and you need to renew it before Ldap will work anymore, which we'll talk about a little bit when we get into authentication. And there's the delete feature, which I'm going to switch to a different user before I do anything with that. So I'm looking at Bill Intranet. I want to delete this user. Every single object in dotCMS is owned by somebody. If you are going to delete a user, then everything that user owns needs to be taken over by somebody else. So you have to select, okay, well, Chris is going to get all of Bill's objects now. I'm going to hit delete. And in a system with a lot of content, a lot of users, a lot of activity, this is a process that'll take a while. So you want to try and do this at a low activity time because it will take some time. In this case, it's pretty straightforward just because there's not a lot of content on this site. There's not a lot for it to go through in the database. So that's users. Users are really pretty straightforward. Roles are a bit more involved. So there's a number of system roles which you need to keep around in order for dotCMS backend processes and administration need to be able to use. There are also user-created roles. So you can have a role tree of various different user roles that will actually be used to manage people's access to content itself. You shouldn't be assigning system roles to most users. Those should really only go to people who are going to be administrators. So that gets us to a couple of critical roles here. First of which is the Cms Administrator. This is a super user. This permission allows access to all portlets and objects regardless of permissions. So you could set up an object and explicitly say, Cms Administrator doesn't have access to edit this object. Doesn't matter. Cms Administrator will still be able to edit that object. So yeah, you can't stop the Cms Administrator from having access to anything. The next one is Cms Anonymous. This is an absolutely critical role for displaying content to the public. It allows objects to be accessed by anybody who is not logged into the backend. If you want a public-facing site, the objects have to have Cms Anonymous view. Now, an object has to be published before it can be viewed, but you can publish something, and if it doesn't have Cms Anonymous view permissions, then nobody will be able to see it without logging in. And that's actually a problem I see happen fairly often. That people will go into their content here and they'll say, oh, we don't want anonymous people to have access, so we're going to take away the CMS Anonymous access to everything. And then suddenly nobody can see their website. They just get a 404 error when they try and hit it. CMS owner, it's another system role. This is the user who creates an object. So when an object first gets created, it is assigned a owner, and that goes back to where we run that delete, where we reassign objects to new users. There is a role, actually it isn't listed here, but there is a backend role called current user, and that's used in workflows. It's not dependent on, it's not something you assign to users. It's just whoever is currently taking action on a step in a workflow is the current user. There are two related roles here, Ldap user and logged in site user, which can both be used to assign a certain set of permissions to every single person that logs in. So you say, if anyone logs into the back end, I want them to have this permission on this object. And you can use that for things that everybody needs to have access to. There may be certain folders or certain paths where you're like, okay, all logged in site users need to have access to this folder of images or whatever. So you could use the logged in site user or the Ldap user if you're using Ldap to manage that. There is the final special role here is called the login as, which is a super useful tool for troubleshooting. So if a user comes to you and reports, hey, I'm seeing this weird thing happen, and you go through and you log in and you try and replicate it, and you say, I'm not seeing that happen, well, you can log in as that person. Say, I'm going to log in as Jane. And so suddenly you can only see the things that Jane has access to. Jane cannot see the site browser. Jane can only go into specific content, and she wouldn't even have access to all the content, only the stuff that her set of rules allows her access to. But you can then go in as Jane and try and replicate the problem and say, oh, well, when I'm logged in as her, I am seeing this problem. So that will help you try and isolate problems with content. That's a super useful role to have there. So within roles, roles will have sets of permissions. You can apply permissions at the site level. You can apply them at the folder level. You can say, oh, well, everyone on demo.cms/intranet has one set of permissions, but I'm also going to have a set of permissions for just the main.cms site. And as you go further down the tree, like if you restrict intranet more than you did demo, then it's going to respect whatever permissions on the objects under intranet, and everything under intranet will inherit intranet's permissions and not demo's permissions. As you're making changes, be aware cascading changes is a big hit on the database. It has to go through everything and check if it needs to have its permissions updated. So hitting that apply changes on a cascade can be a very, very heavy process. The next tab on a role is the Tools tab. Tools is these objects here on the side, these tool groups that give you the ability to do things. So those tools, it'll say, home has these particular tools in it. Site has these particular tools in it. System has these tools. You can create a custom tool group. You may say, oh, I've got a role where I want them to have access to, let's say, I want to put it at the bottom of the list. I want to have access to content types, and I want them to have access to the job scheduler. But I don't want them to have access to categories or tags or workflows, so I'm not going to give them the types and tags one. I'm going to create this new one that I can now give someone permission to. You can also go in and edit. So for example, you say, well, the system users, I want them to also have the job scheduler. I'm going to add job scheduler and save that. Now you'd have to log out and log back in for everything to show back up, but that's how you would make changes to what tools are available under one of these particular tool groups, or to create a custom tool group that allows you to limit certain roles to certain utilities. So the next thing we will talk about is another aspect of, is that correct? Yeah, so as part of users and roles, I'll talk real briefly about authentication. So out of the box, users and their roles are stored here in dotCMS. You can use other authentication methods. Traditionally, the most popular approach has been Ldap. Active Directory is a form of Ldap, so we lump it in with that, and we use the same library to connect to Active Directory as we do to open Ldap. Setting up Ldap is pretty straightforward. The catch being you can't turn on Ldap until after you've applied your license. So if you are setting up a new system, you'll want to first log in, go to your configuration, set up your license, and then do your Ldap configuration, which requires stopping and restarting dotCMS. And so it's also important where keeping an eye on when does your license expire, because if your license expires and you're using Ldap, then suddenly nobody can log in. And you actually have to stop dotCMS, pull out the Ldap configuration, start it up, license your instance, stop your instance, reapply the Ldap configuration, and then start dotCMS back up again. It's kind of tedious. Doing the actual Ldap configuration is really simple. I'm just going to walk through how we would do a basic setup and explain what these components are. And most people simply go in and copy our existing configuration. You add your plugins, conf, portal-ext.properties, and this is all documented on the page. And you put in your Ldap configuration. You do have to declare everything. Even if you're not using security, you have to declare the security authentication and the key store path. You put in the Ldap host, you put in Ldap port, you put in all of the Ldap DN information and the user. You put in the user and password of an Ldap user that has permission to look up other users. This isn't your actual user. This is just the user that's used to connect to Ldap and manage that connection. And then when people log in, they tunnel over that connection to get their authentication back from Ldap. When you are building this, what we most often recommend, and not so much in Active Directory, because Active Directory is a lot easier to manage, but if you're using like an open Ldap or an older Ldap implementation, they don't do trees very well. So we'll say create your Ldap groups with the .cms underscore in front of the group, so they all get grouped together in your Ldap admin. And that's this build group name. And then we have a strip filter when we're pulling stuff back, because here in .cms, obviously, you're in .cms. You don't need for the role to say .cms underscore administrator. You already know it's .cms administrator. So we just strip off that as it comes back from Ldap. You don't have to do this. And again, if you're using something like Active Directory, we already have the filter in place to manage that properly without having the .cms underscore. So, and the other thing that you can set here is, do we want to sync passwords? I don't recommend it. What it means is that if Ldap goes down, then dotCMS will allow users to still log in using their last known password. I think it's a bad idea from a security perspective to do that, and I don't recommend it, but it is something you can do. The downside being that if your Ldap goes down, nobody can log in. So it's a trade-off. And this is as simple as restart your deploy your plugins, restart dotCMS. The biggest problem I see with Ldap is one, making sure that the DN is correct. Ldap is really precise. And the other is firewall, making sure that there's an open connection to the Ldap server. Those are the two biggest problems I see with setting up Ldap. And then the third one, having the groups in Ldap set up properly. You can use Ldap just to authenticate, in which this build groups would be set to false. If you want to just use Ldap to authenticate users and not assign them to groups, you can do that. If you set this groups to true, then you have to set up all of your user groups, all of these publisher, legal, reviewer, all those will be set up in Ldap, and what users or members, what groups will be managed in Ldap. And there's certainly good argument to be made for doing it that way. It's a lot easier to manage all of your user stuff in one place. So that's one of your options here, is to build groups equals true or not true. But if you're doing it as true, you have to make sure that in Ldap, this is an exact match. So you couldn't put reviewer with a lowercase r in Ldap and have your user get assigned the correct role, because it has to be an exact match. And so, yeah, this one is publisher legal. There's a space there. There's a space before and after the slash. If you do this without the space before and after the slash in your Ldap, and someone is assigned this role, it's going to pull over from Ldap the wrong role. And so it's not going to work. There's a lot more customers wanting to move to things like OAuth, which we do support. We have a plugin for supporting that on our share. Let's go to on our code share. Was maybe there's not anymore. Nope, it's not there anymore. That's weird. Oh, it might be in GitHub now. Yeah, it looks like there's less here. Yeah, I don't even see the authentication anymore on here. So that must have all been moved to GitHub. So, but there's a SAML plugin that does not currently work on 5. 5 hasn't come out yet, obviously. It'll be out later this week. But we are working on a 5 version of the SAML plugin, which is definitely starting to take off and replace Ldap in terms of popularity.